I'm Ben Bindewald, and this is Philosophical Foundations of Social Research, an introduction and overview. First, some key concepts. We'll define each term, and we'll show how they relate to one another on the individual slides that follow. Okay, so this may look a little overwhelming and a little complex for an opening slide, but let's break it down and we'll return back periodically to it. The first thing that we'll do is take a look at these different orientations, we'll call them. And one note that I'd like to say at the outset is that not all scholars are going to use all of these terms in exactly the same way. There's definitely going to be disagreement. There's going to be different terms used to apply to the same concepts, and there'll be different ways of thinking about similar concepts. But let's start with the orientations. The first one might be considered an empirical analytic orientation. This is what we mostly would associate with science, traditionally understood in the West. So the empirical component deals with experience, so data. If you collect data, either quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, if you're collecting sense data through observations, through interviews, from documents, wherever the data comes from, that's empirical research. The analytic part is analysis, and traditionally understood analysis deals with looking at the data, so you're using the empirical component, but you're also using a rational component. You're applying the rules of formal logic to your analysis of the data. So again, the analytic component has to do with making rational inferences from the data using logic, using critique, critical thinking, to make sense of the data and try to understand natural phenomena and objects of reality. Okay, the next section here, the next orientation is the interpretive orientation. So if we said that the empirical analytic orientation has to do mostly with the orientation of science as we traditionally understood it in the West, the interpretive tradition has more to do with the humanities. So if you think, for example, about history or philosophy, those traditionally have taken a more interpretive approach. So if the empirical analytic approach is more concerned with objective reality, trying to understand knowledge of the phenomena directly, interpretivism shifts the focus from objective reality to what we'll call socially constructed or social reality. So interpretivism doesn't try to understand the objective world as it is outside of our heads. Rather, it tries to understand socially constructed meanings that human beings have made and that they share with one another through like a mutual understanding. So let me give you an example real quick. So if there is a group of people, a nation or a tribe or a culture or a subculture, and they have certain beliefs about the world, about, they have customs, they have practices, they have language. An interpretive approach would try to understand the meaning of those socially constructed concepts and objects and phenomena. Okay, so empirical analytic is more scientific in the traditional sense. Interpretive is more having to do with the humanities in the traditional sense. And then this one's a little tougher because the meanings of the words aren't always as clear and straightforward. So when people in this orientation, the critical orientation, use the word critical, they don't necessarily mean it in the same way that a scientist might use the word. Those of you who are teachers, you may have taught critical thinking skills. In this orientation, yes, that's a component of the meaning of critical. But there's also a way in which critical, like in critical theory, for example, it means neo-Marxist. So this analysis, like a critical theory, for example, is a way of looking at existing social systems. So, for example, looking at constitutional democracies, looking at market economies, looking at school systems, looking at whatever type of system. Typically, this orientation has looked at systems in the West, so in Europe and in the countries where Europeans colonized and settled, and their descendants represent majorities today in the world. So this orientation, the critical orientation, is a way of looking at those systems and structures and societies and so on, and critiquing them for a certain purpose. And that purpose is what Habermas called the emancipatory interests. So generally speaking, the goal of this whole orientation is to advance what we might call social justice or socialism, equality, egalitarianism, those kinds of values through critique, through a political analysis, an economic analysis, a critical approach that points out flaws and sometimes prescribes solutions to those flaws, those perceived flaws. I'll say that because there's, of course, many criticisms of critical theory and the critical orientation more broadly. Okay, we're going to revisit this periodically. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So there are, obviously, there's a lot of different ways of doing research. We're not really focused on like natural science in this class. We're more focused on social inquiry. So in the social sciences and the humanities. So for example, in the academic disciplines of anthropology, history, sociology, philosophy, and psychology. Here are some different approaches. Quantitative inquiry, so using numerical, mathematical analyses and data. This is a lot more mathematically precise, so you can do statistical analysis for example. You use data that can be quantified, and the analysis can be so precise that you can say, I have this level of confidence in the predictability or the generalizability of these findings. Okay. Qualitative inquiry, on the other hand, deals with quality rather than quantity. So it deals with description. It deals with it doesn't always deal with generalizability. Oftentimes it will deal with more specific and local situated contextual knowledge and meaning, whereas quantitative is trying typically to make generalizations from a sample from a larger population. Okay, so qualitative again is trying to understand socially constructed meanings for the most part. All right, mixed methods takes a little bit of the tools from quantitative and qualitative research and applies them based on a different number of philosophies for different purposes, but you're really combining methods from each approach guided by some set of philosophical beliefs towards some purpose. All right, historical research has a traditional method that is very much interpretive. Sometimes historians use quantitative data. Sometimes they often use qualitative data. So, primary sources, photographs, newspaper articles, letters, and so on and so forth. And analyzing these different sources and trying to understand not only the meanings that we can make today about them, but the intentions of the authors who created them, the meanings that they would have held for the social context at the time, the historical context at the time, and so on. Historiographical inquiry, on the other hand, looks at historical research over time and tries to make sense of the themes and the ways in which historians have understood different periods of time, different phenomena, and so on. So you have histories, and then you have historiography, which is really like history of history, intellectual histories, ways in which historians have understood the past. Okay, and then we'll look at philosophical inquiry just a little bit here, but really, if you're trying to understand normative concepts, and by normative I mean whereas science is more concerned with facts about objective reality or social reality, normative inquiry, philosophical inquiry, tends to be more concerned with norms. So if science deals with is the way the world is, philosophy tends to deal with oughts, the way things ought to be, norms, what we should do, what our social systems ought to be structured as, what goals and values we ought to value, and so on and so forth. So philosophical inquiry can be engaged with evidence, empirical research, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Sometimes it is more just of a rationalist approach where you're using reason and logic in your analysis, your interpretations, not specifically limited to inferences from scientific data. Okay, next slide. So when you're planning social research, it usually begins with a problem, a research purpose, or a set of research questions. Okay? The next step is typically to find a methodology to help you to fulfill that purpose, answer those questions, address that research problem. Okay, but good scholars are expected to justify their methodological choices. All right, so you have to answer the question to potential critics, to readers, to people who might be influenced by your study. Why did I use this methodology? So you have to provide a rationale for your choices. And this might be more explicitly stated in some fields and in some types of research than in others. And hopefully that'll make sense as we keep moving. Okay, so what is a methodology? Now we're going to start defining and giving examples for some of the key concepts we've talked about. A methodology is a systematic design to obtain knowledge. So this isn't just wandering around like a person on the street and learning in our day-to-day lives. This is more focused, more intentional, more systematic, more rigorous than just the person on the street approach to learning. Some examples of methodologies might be ethnography. So in an ethnography, for example, a qualitative researcher or an anthropologist might go into a community and they're trying to understand culture. They're trying to understand the meanings of the people in that culture or that subculture, that small group. So it's culture focused. It deals with interviewing. It deals with observation. Sometimes we call it participant observation. We'll talk about that when we get to methods. Experimental design is another methodology that is almost always a quantitative approach. So this would be like laboratory research, really looking for correlations and sometimes even causal relationships between variables. So if we control the setting and we give this group of students this educational treatment and we give this other group of students a standard treatment, just use the same methods we've been using, then that'll be the control group, and the first one will be the experimental group. We'll take some kind of data through measurements, like a standardized test, and then we'll look at the results and we'll try to see correlations between the experiment and the outcomes. Case study research, we'll get into more detail about that later, but here a basic understanding, it's typically qualitative, but it's not exclusively qualitative. So sometimes they do have quantitative data in them. But typically a qualitative case study is a study that looks at a local phenomenon. It sets parameters, limits to what will be studied in the case. So case boundaries, you might say. So for example, I might study just students at Oklahoma State University in a philosophy of research course offered online, and that might be my case. And then I'll have questions, I'll have a research problem, I'll have a purpose, and so on, directly related to that case. And then, of course, survey research, you're probably more familiar with this. If I design a survey with forced choice items. So methodology is informed by a research paradigm, and we're going to get into paradigms. That's really the focus of this class, how paradigms relate to methodologies. But a research paradigm is that bundle of philosophical assumptions that guide, ground, and justify a particular research design. So the components that we'll focus on of a paradigm in this class would be the ontological beliefs, the epistemological beliefs, and the axiological beliefs or assumptions. I'm going to save that for future slides to get into what those are, but just basically ontology deals with reality, beliefs about reality. Epistemology deals with knowledge, theories of knowledge, beliefs about knowledge, what's possible to know, and so on and so forth, how we know. And then axiology tends to deal with values, so things like ethics, politics. So you can almost think of it like a hierarchy where the paradigm is the foundation, the bottom. The methodology is guided by and influenced by the paradigm. And then the methods are used in a certain way toward a certain purpose and informed by the methodology and the paradigm. We'll review that as well. Okay, when we're justifying our choice of the methodology, we need to consider ontological questions, like our assumptions about the nature of reality. And these are not always explicitly stated. In fact, they're rarely explicitly stated. They're implied and reflected in the research purpose and the methodology. So if I'm going to do a survey, I have certain beliefs about reality. If I expect to be able to take a sample, a survey of the people in that sample, and then make generalizations, statistical generalizations using rigorous methods to make predictions or claims about a larger population, about how they think or how they will behave in certain circumstances. That is guided by beliefs about reality. When pollsters, for example, tell us, how different presidential candidates are doing in public opinion, who supports who and who's ahead and so on, they're also making predictions about who would win if the election were held at that moment in time. And right up before the polls close on election day, what they're trying to do is predict as accurately as possible based on samples what the population, the larger population, for example, of American voters will do when they go to the polls. That is all informed by beliefs about reality, beliefs about science, and beliefs about what we can know and what we can predict with accuracy. And there's always a margin of error. We have to also look, when we're thinking about methodology, at our assumptions about our relationship with reality. So how do human beings relate to reality itself? Can we be objective? Can we step apart from the object that we're studying and see it from an outsider's perspective? Or are we inherently part of the world, and do we have certain restraints on how objective we can be when studying an object of reality? So those are kinds of questions that, depending on your answer, that's going to inform how you do research. So this is a combination of beliefs about reality, or ontology, and beliefs about knowledge and what's possible to know, how we know, and so on and so forth. Another question, what kind of knowledge will be obtained through the research methodology? Is it the kind of knowledge we intended? All right, why should readers and observers of our research take the outcomes of our research seriously? So when we're talking about questions of validity, reliability, trustworthiness, credibility, and so on, those are epistemological questions, questions of rigor, questions of how much we, the reader, how much weight we should give to the findings of a particular study and why. All right, this is another one that is often glossed over or de-emphasized in traditional research, but it's becoming more and more important as we look into the values that scientists and other types of researchers and inquirers bring to their studies. What primary values inform the choices made in the research process? So why, for example, am I asking this question and not this question? Why am I interested in this phenomenon and not this phenomenon? Why do I consider this relevant data and not this? Of all the data that I collected, why is it that this subset is going to go into the study, but the other things that I could focus on are not going into the study? Those are all value judgments. And for each type of value judgments, one ought to have a rationale for why they made it. And that kind of goes into your research design, either implicitly or explicitly stated. Okay, so let's look at fit, conceptual fit among these different elements of social research. Answers to the ontological and epistemological questions lie with the paradigm underpinning the methodology. So if I have a paradigm, for example, let's say post-positivism. We'll talk about more about what that is, but that's if we want to talk about contemporary social science, where you're using mostly quantitative research methods. Post-positivism is the paradigm that underpins a methodology, for example, survey research. So if you're doing post-positivist paradigm and survey research as your methodology, that whole process is going to be guided by ontological and epistemological beliefs and understandings. So is there a conceptual match between our research purpose, questions, and the methodology? Okay, if you're doing a dissertation, for example, you need to make sure that whatever your purposes are, whatever your philosophical beliefs are, that they're consistent, that they're clear, that there's an internal coherence and rationality to your design and your approach.